The first wind of November 1891 didn't strike the cabin from above. It came from beneath. Beside the stove, Old Boone lifted his head and released a low growl toward the north wall. A deep, instinctual sound, a warning of some unseen creature creeping into the house. Kellen Whitaker snapped awake. The prairie wind no longer just howled outside. Now it moved beneath the floorboards, a sharp, invisible current, thin and cold as a creek in January. He slipped from the bed, knelt, and pressed his bare palm against a seam in the floor. The wood felt as cold as metal. Near the stove, Caleb slept curled tight beneath his wool blankets. Beside him, Miriam's eyes remained shut, but one hand rested unconsciously across her swelling belly, shielding the unborn child even in her sleep. Kellen stood and looked out the window. In the pale moonlight, the unfinished ring of stone around the wooden walls stood like a bizarre, desolate structure out on the open prairie. It was only half completed. In that moment, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. If winter arrived before that stone wall was finished, the child in Miriam's belly might never live to see the spring. The race was no longer against the rock and mortar. It was the heavy toll exacted for a rushed mistake in the past. The Whitaker cabin had been built fast after the drought year. Too fast. The cottonwood logs had shrunk before the first real winter even ended. Wind found the gaps easily. Snow pushed beneath the walls in thin white lines that melted across the floorboards by day and froze hard again after dark. Last January, ice formed beside the bed itself. The stove burned nearly every hour of the night, yet the warmth vanished as quickly as it came, like water thrown onto dry stone. Then came the night the chimney failed. A hard downdraft shoved smoke back into the cabin, so fast the lantern disappeared behind gray haze. Miriam doubled over coughing in the dark, while Caleb cried for air. Kellen dragged the door open against the storm. Snow exploded inside. White powder raced across the floor with the wind. After that night, he stopped blaming the cold alone. He started watching the way air moved. To break those invisible currents, he turned to the heaviest, most unforgiving materials he could find. It was a choice that soon drew the stares of the entire valley. By September of 1891, people in Black Elk Basin had started slowing their horses whenever they passed the Whitaker place. Not because the cabin looked impressive, because it looked wrong. Every few days, Kellen Whitaker appeared along the dry wash south of the basin, dragging another sled load of black basalt toward the ridge. The rocks were heavy enough to leave deep scars through the prairie grass behind him. Some pieces were smooth from old floodwater. Others came from broken shale shelves higher up the slope. Men hauling firewood for winter watched him in silence at first. Then the jokes began. Man's building himself a stone freezer. Must think rocks burn hotter than pine? Kellen ignored all of it. He stacked the basalt carefully beside the cabin, choosing flatter pieces for the outer face and heavier stone for the lower footing trench. One afternoon, Wade Mercer, a cattle rancher whose place sat 2 miles west of the basin, reined his horse beside the unfinished wall and stayed there watching for several minutes. The stone shell already reached nearly waist-high along the north side of the cabin. But what bothered Wade most was not the wall itself. It was the empty space behind it. A narrow gap separated the stone from the cottonwood cabin, wide enough to slide a hand through in some places. Wade finally stepped closer and frowned at it. "The hell's the point of leaving air back there?" he asked. Kellen kept working mortar into a seam without looking up. The prairie wind rolled over the ridge behind them, bending the dry grass flat for a moment before passing on. Near the doorway, Miriam Whitaker stood wrapped in a wool shawl, one hand resting low against the child she carried. Wade looked from the unfinished wall to her face. The confusion in his expression faded slowly into something heavier. Concern. Wade Mercer finally swung down from his saddle and walked toward the wall with the slow caution of a man inspecting something unstable. He pressed his glove against one of the basalt stones. Even under the weak autumn sun, the rock already felt cold. "That thing's gonna hold winter. Like a cellar," he said. Kellen kept working quietly. Mortar coated both hands nearly to the wrists. He set another flat piece of shale into place and pressed it down carefully with the handle of his trowel. Wade motioned toward the narrow cavity behind the wall. Snow gets in there, moisture freezes, and this whole shell turned into a dead cold pocket. He shook his head once. You wrap stone around wood. You're building a coffin, not a house. The words carried no cruelty, only certainty. Wade had survived 20 winters in Montana territory by trusting what could be seen plainly. Thick timber, sod banks, low roofs, dry fuel. Those things made sense. This did not. I got boys could help you bank the foundation proper before first freeze, he continued. Sod and manure hold heat better than rock ever will. Near the doorway, Caleb crouched beside the basalt pile, stacking smaller stones into crooked little towers while Boone watched from the porch. For a moment, Wade looked at the child, then toward Miriam, standing behind him beneath her shawl. The concern in his eyes deepened. Kellen finally spoke without looking up. The cold ain't what gets inside first. Wade frowned slightly, waiting. The prairie wind swept over the ridge again, rattling dry grass against the lower stones. Kellen lifted another piece of shale from the sled. The wind carries it. Years earlier, before Black Elk Basin and before the cabin on the ridge, Kellen Whitaker had worked the Idaho Silver camps as a labor hand for Gideon Pike, an old Cornish stonemason known for building smoke sheds that stayed dry through mountain winters. Gideon never explained things the way schoolmen did. He taught with weather. On bitter evenings, he would make young workers stand outside the sheds and hold their hands near different wall seams until they could feel where warmth disappeared fastest. Not where the air felt coldest, where it moved. One winter night, he brought Kellen into a small root storage hut built against a granite slope high above the camps. Outside, mountain winds screamed through the pass hard enough to shake loose snow from the roof beams. The sound carried through the darkness like steel, tearing apart. Inside, almost nothing moved. Gideon lit a candle and placed it beside the inner wall. The flame stayed perfectly still, not even a tremble. Heat survives where air dies, the old stonemason said quietly. He showed Kellen the thick outer stone shell first, then the narrow cavity behind it, then the vent gaps hidden low beneath the footing and high beneath the roofline. Wind pressure hits the outer wall, he explained. Dead air holds what stays behind. The stone itself gathered weak sunlight during the day and released it slowly after dark. But the real protection came from stillness. Air trapped without movement. Air unable to carry heat away. Then Gideon knelt beside one lower vent and scraped moisture from the seam with his thumb. Trap wet inside these walls, he warned, and winter turns the whole thing against you. Kellen never forgot that part, not even once. The wall around the Whitaker cabin was never meant to be solid. That was the part nobody understood. Kellen dug a drainage trench nearly 1.5 feet deep around the north and west sides first. He filled the bottom with coarse gravel hauled up from the creek bed before placing the heavier basalt footing stones above it. Lower along the outer edge, he built a short, angled skirt of rock meant to break drifting snow before it packed against the foundation. Nothing about the work happened quickly. Every few feet, he left narrow vent gaps hidden low between the stones. Others sat higher beneath the roofline, staggered carefully so wind could not blow straight through the cavity. One afternoon, Caleb watched him leave another opening between two shale pieces and frowned. I thought the wind's what you're stopping. Kellen tamped mortar into a seam with the side of his trowel. It is. Then why leave holes? The question hung there a moment, beneath the steady prairie breeze moving over the ridge. Kellen finally looked toward the narrow cavity between the cabin and the stone shell. Because trapped wet kills slower than cold, he said. Near the doorway, Miriam paused her sewing without realizing it. She had been patching together small pieces of worn wool from one of Kellen's old winter shirts. Cloth meant for the child that had not yet been born. For several seconds, she simply watched her husband work. The stone wall rose slowly around the cabin, not tight, not sealed. Breathing. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time that season. Boone circled twice beside the stove, then settled near Caleb's blankets. But even now, The old dog still refused to sleep beside the north wall. The first hard freeze arrived early in October. By dawn, thin frost had formed along the lower north seam inside the cavity wall. Kellen noticed it immediately. Moisture had gathered there overnight and failed to clear fast enough through the lower vents. If deeper freezes came before the seam dried properly, expanding ice would begin cracking the mortar from within. Worse than that, the damp stone could start carrying cold straight toward the cabin wall itself. A cold bridge. He tore part of the section apart before breakfast. Chunks of half-frozen mortar hit the gravel trench below while pale steam rose from the exposed seam into the morning air. Wade Mercer happened to ride past, just as Kellen drove a chisel into another fresh section. The rancher watched silently for a moment before shaking his head. "Told you," he said. "Stone sweats colder than wood." For once the wall looked less like a plan and more like a mistake, but Kellen never answered him. He widened the lower drainage slit instead. Then he mixed a heavier lime blend into the next batch of mortar and rebuilt the section from the footing upward. By afternoon, thin snow had begun settling lightly across the gravel trench. Kellen stood staring at the repaired seam for a long time without moving. 2 days later, Evelyn Rourke arrived with the weekly mail, wrapped inside a leather satchel dusted white with trail frost. She studied the unfinished north wall for a long time before speaking. Most people asked Kellen why he was building with stone. Evelyn asked something else entirely. "You ain't building for warmth," she said quietly. "You're building for stillness." Kellen looked at her then. Really looked at her. It was the first time anyone had understood the difference. Near the west wall, Caleb coaxed Boone onto an old blanket beside the newly finished stone section. The old hound circled once, then lowered himself slowly onto the floorboards and stayed there. Miriam noticed it before anyone else. Her eyes moved from the sleeping dog to the wall beside him. Then, without realizing it, her hand slipped away from her stomach for the first time in weeks. The first week of November arrived with a bitter wind that did not seem to care about the labor behind the cabin's walls. The stone shell was complete, not beautiful, not perfectly aligned. Some sections remained rough, jagged from Kellen's insistence on thickness over appearance. Every slab of basalt and shale had been placed with purpose, yet the structure looked more like a barricade than a home. The prairie itself shifted. Birds vanished from the ridge. The air thickened. Boone began pacing the cabin perimeter in cautious circles. Even the antelope lowered their heads as they slipped down into the distant ravine, sensing the coming storm. Kellen walked the perimeter, checking vent openings, the drainage trench, and the chimney draw. Each measurement and observation confirmed that the system was ready or as ready as it could be. Yet the silence carried weight. The world outside felt heavy, as if holding its breath. That night, Kellen slept in short bursts, waking to the scrape of gravel outside, the whisper of wind bending through the ridge, and Boone's low growl echoing the tension he felt but could not articulate. Nature had noticed the cabin. Not in fury, yet not with leniency either. It had circled, examined, and decided it was time to test. From the porch, under a sky gray and dense, Kellen looked back at the half-finished mortar seams, the jagged stone edges catching faint moonlight, and understood fully the race about to begin. Every motion of wind, every rustle of dry grass, seemed magnified. The storm was patient, calculating, and unstoppable. All that remained was to see if the shell he had built could survive its judgment. The first real blizzard arrived faster than anyone in the basin expected. It did not build slowly. It did not waver. It struck like an invisible wall, plunging from the north, crashing against the ridge with a force that shook loose prairie grass for hundreds of yards. Kellen Whitaker moved quickly. He dragged water barrels into the cabin. He wrapped cloth around the doors. He covered the woodpile with heavy canvas. Every motion precise, every action calculated. Then the storm hit full. The first sound was not the wind. It was the rasp of countless snow grains scrabbling across the surface of the stone shell, like thousands of fingernails scraping the rock. Caleb jolted awake, his eyes wide. Boone sprang up beside the stove, growling toward the chimney as if warning Kellen about what was coming. Within a minute, a downdraft pushed the first plume of smoke back down the chimney. Not as strong as last winter, not enough to choke the cabin, but enough to confirm one thing to Kellen. Nature had found the first weakness to test. He glanced at the chimney. The lamp flame trembled faintly, but held steady. He glanced at the northern stone wall. Snow pressed against it like a living thing. Miriam drew Caleb close, wrapping him in her arms, her eyes flicking toward the doorway, then back at the fire. Kellen understood. This was only the beginning. The battle had started in earnest, and the cabin he had built would be judged in every inch of air, every seam of stone, every vent that carried warmth through the hollow cavity behind the walls. Near midnight, Kellen noticed the lower north vent beginning to disappear beneath packed, drifting snow. That frightened him more than the wind itself. If the airflow beneath the cavity died completely, moisture would stop escaping. The lower seams would freeze solid, and once enough cold bridged through the damp stone, the entire wall system could begin pulling heat inward instead of holding it back. He grabbed his coat and the iron pry bar beside the door. The moment he stepped outside, the storm hit him sideways. Visibility vanished almost completely. White powder swarmed through the darkness hard enough to sting exposed skin like shattered glass. Boone howled once from inside the cabin, but refused to follow him into the blizzard. Kellen forced his way along the north wall, one hand at a time. Snow had already crusted over the lower vent opening. He dropped to one knee and drove the pry bar into the ice buildup. Frozen chunks broke loose and vanished instantly beneath the drifting snow. Another gust slammed into him so violently it threw his shoulder against the stone shell. And there in the middle of the whiteout, he realized something important. The cabin behind the wall was no longer shaking. The wind was striking stone now. Not wood, not seams, not floorboards. The shell was taking the full force of the storm. Kellen widened the lower vent nearly 2 inches more, then wedged an angled shale plate beside the opening to divert loose powder away from the airflow channel. By the time he fought his way back inside, his coat was white with ice. He said almost nothing. He only placed one hand against the north wall. Then he looked at the lamp beside the stove. The flame stood straighter than before. By the middle of the second night, Caleb woke for reasons he could not explain at first. He lay still beneath the blankets, listening to the storm. Then he realized what was missing. The little tin cup hanging beside the stove no longer rattled against the nail in the wall. Last winter it had clicked and trembled through nearly every hard wind. The entire cabin used to shiver when the prairie storms struck the ridge. Floorboards vibrated. Wall seams hissed. Even the bed frame creaked softly during the worst gusts. Now the sound was gone. Boone slept stretched beside the west wall with his nose tucked beneath his tail. He no longer avoided the north side of the cabin. Near dawn, Miriam carefully pulled one wool blanket away from Caleb's legs. A small movement, almost unconscious, but she had never dared do that during the previous winter. Kellen checked the indoor woodpile shortly afterward and stood there quietly, counting what remained. They had burned far less fuel than he expected for a storm this violent. Still, he refused to trust the victory too soon. During another inspection outside the cavity, he found a thin crack beginning to form along one lower mortar seam near the drainage skirt. Freeze-thaw pressure. Small, manageable, but real. The storm had not stopped testing the wall. When Kellen returned inside, Boone barely lifted his head from sleep, and sometime before sunrise, Miriam drifted off in the rocking chair without one hand resting protectively across her stomach. The third day of the blizzard buried Black Elk Basin beneath a world of moving white. Outside the cabin, wind screamed across the ridge hard enough to send fresh drifts curling halfway up the lower stone vents. Snow scraped continuously across the shell in long, dry waves. Inside, the cabin felt strangely distant from the storm. Not silent, but separated from it. Caleb sat cross-legged near the stove, carving shapes into scraps of pine with a dull pocket knife, while Boone slept nearby, rising only now and then to shift closer toward the warmth. The oil lamp burned with a steady, narrow flame. No trembling, no sudden draft. Even their breathing looked different. The air inside no longer carried thick clouds of frost, with every word an exhale. Kellen sat near the table repairing a cracked harness strap beneath the lamp glow. Across from him, Miriam worked quietly with a needle and thread, cutting pieces from one of Kellen's worn winter coats to sew a small shirt for the baby. Neither of them spoke much. There was no dramatic moment when the cabin suddenly became warm. That was not what changed. The difference was simpler than that. The heat stayed where it was made. The stove no longer fought the entire prairie by itself. The walls were no longer bleeding warmth into the wind. The cabin had finally stopped surrendering every ounce of heat the moment it was born. Kellen looked up once from the harness leather and watched Miriam sewing beside the steady lamp while the blizzard roared beyond the stone shell. And for the first time since building the cabin on the ridge, he understood something deeply enough to feel it. The house was protecting them now, not merely holding them inside it. On the fourth morning, the storm stopped so suddenly the silence felt unnatural. Kellen had to drive his shoulder against the door before it finally broke through the drift packed outside. Snow stood nearly chest high along the north side of the cabin. Black Elk Basin had vanished beneath white. No tracks. No wind movement. Only frozen stillness stretching across the ridge. Kellen walked slowly around the stone shell, inspecting the damage. The outer wall was brutally cold. Frost filled the mortar seams in pale white veins. Snow had packed hard against the north face until the drifts looked almost fused to the basalt itself. He pressed one bare hand against the stone. Pain shot through his fingers immediately. Then he stepped into the narrow inspection gap between the shell and the cabin wall. The difference was unmistakable. The wood felt cool, but not frozen. Not like the old winters, when cold seemed to push directly through the walls and settle inside the bones of the cabin itself. Near the south skirt, he pried open the rain barrel lid. Thick ice covered the surface, yet the water beneath still moved dark and heavy below it. Boone followed him quietly into the cavity and lowered himself onto the ground between the two walls, the very place drafts used to scream through the hardest. Kellen stood there for a long moment, with one hand on stone and the other against wood, and he finally understood that Gideon Pike had been right all those years ago. Cold only survived where air kept moving. Late that afternoon, Wade Mercer appeared through the drifting white along the ridge trail. He moved slowly through snow, nearly to his hips. Exhaustion showed in every step. His face looked raw from windburn, and frost clung white along the edges of his beard. The prairie storm had not spared his place. The north sod bank around his cabin had torn loose during the second night of the blizzard. Part of the woodshed roof collapsed beneath drifting snow. Half his feed barrels disappeared entirely beneath the drifts piling against the fence line. Wade had come to check whether the Whitakers were still alive. Kellen opened the door without surprise. The rancher stepped inside and stopped immediately. Not because the cabin felt hot, because it did not feel under attack. No drafts hissed through the seams. No smoke hung trapped beneath the roof beams. No trembling traveled through the floorboards beneath his boots. Caleb sat near the stove eating elk stew quietly, while Boone slept stretched along the north wall. Wade noticed the dog first, then the lamp flame, perfectly steady. Slowly, he crossed the room and placed one gloved hand against the west wall. Silence settled heavily inside the cabin. Outside, the prairie still groaned beneath shifting drifts and frozen wind. Inside, the air barely moved at all. And standing there with his hand against the wall, Wade Mercer felt the first hard cracks spread through everything he had trusted for 20 winters. Kellen handed Wade a steaming bowl of elk stew and returned quietly to the stove. No smile. No pride. No, I told you so. Wade sat at the table eating slowly, but his eyes kept drifting around the cabin as though he expected to uncover some hidden trick buried inside the walls. Finally, he looked toward the stove. "It ain't warmer in here than mine," he admitted. Kellen nodded once. "It don't lose itself." The words settled into the room beside the sound of the fire. Wade sat there another long moment, staring toward the north wall, where Boone still slept without concern beneath the steady lamp glow. Then he spoke again, softer this time. "The air ain't moving." Nobody answered immediately. Not Kellen, not Miriam, because all of them understood that he had finally reached the center of it. That was the whole secret. Not bigger fires, not thicker blankets, not more wood, still air. Near the stove, Caleb slowly drifted asleep, with the empty stew bowl resting in his lap. Miriam looked toward the north wall, the same wall that had once frozen white during the previous winter, and quietly turned her face away before anyone noticed the tears gathering in her eyes. Spring returned slowly to Black Elk Basin. Snow retreated from the ridge in uneven scars across the prairie, exposing dead grass, broken fence posts, and the dark gravel lines around the Whitaker cabin. Water dripped steadily from the stone shell during the afternoons, then froze hard again each night beneath the lingering mountain cold. By then, people no longer laughed when they rode past the ridge. They looked, and they remembered the blizzard. Wade Mercer came back first, not to argue, not to warn Kellen that stone held cold. This time he arrived carrying a small weather-stained notebook tucked beneath one arm. The rancher spent nearly an hour circling the cabin, while Kellen worked near the south drainage trench, repairing winter cracks in the mortar seams. Finally, Wade stopped beside the north wall and opened the notebook. "How wide's the cavity?" Kellen answered without looking up. "Near 8 inches on the north side. Narrower east." Wade scribbled quickly. "What angle you cut the drainage?" "Enough for spring melt to keep moving." "And the vent spacing?" Kellen set down the trowel at last. Then he picked up a stick and drew airflow lines through the wet dirt beside the trench. "Curving paths, drift directions, pressure points where the prairie winds struck hardest during winter storms." Wade studied the sketch carefully. Neither man spoke much after that. They did not need to. Word spread slowly through the basin over the following months. Not that Kellen Whitaker had built the warmest cabin in Montana Territory. Nobody claimed that. Men who visited the ridge still found the rooms modest, the stove ordinary, the heat restrained and practical, but they all repeated the same thing afterward. The cabin had stayed still during the blizzard. That was the detail people remembered. Not roaring fires, not miracle warmth, stillness. By the next winter, a few ranchers began experimenting with smaller versions of the idea. Some built low stone skirts along their north foundations to break drifting snow before it packed against the walls. Others added crude double wall sections facing the prevailing wind. A few copied the drainage trenches after noticing how much spring moisture gathered beneath older cabins. Nobody duplicated the Whitaker shell exactly. Most men lacked the time. Others lacked the patience. A few simply lacked the stone. But the principle traveled anyway. Breathing gaps, dead air, dry walls. Kellen never turned the cabin into a lesson hall. He explained things only when asked directly, usually with a stick drawing lines through dirt or snow while the wind moved across the ridge around him. Years passed. The basalt shell weathered beneath prairie winters. Gray lichen spread slowly across the lower stones. Some mortar seams crumbled and had to be repaired more than once. The north face remained scarred by drifting ice and blowing gravel long after other walls across the basin had been rebuilt entirely. Yet the cabin endured. And Caleb Whitaker grew into a man remembering one truth more clearly than any other. The thing that saved his family had not been a larger fire. It had been his father's understanding of how wind moved through the world. Long after Kellen Whitaker was gone, winter storms still crossed Black Elk Basin exactly as they always had. The prairie still screamed against the ridge. Snow still buried fences. Cold still searched constantly for movement, weakness, and openings. But inside the old Whitaker cabin, the oil lamp continued to burn with a steady flame that never trembled. Have you ever seen an old frontier trick that sounded foolish at first until nature itself proved it right?